Thiago, and today we'll be talking about longitudinal relationships between psychological distress and personality traits. So, I'd like to define some important terms before we start so we do not get confused during the presentation. So, firstly, differentiating distress from stress. So, stress is when it comes to the nature of the experience, is the body's overall response to the stimuli that we have in our day-to-day lives. And you can have either positive stress or negative stress. The positive stress will be called eustress, and this is what happens like before a competition. And an athlete feels that like excitement that makes him practice harder and train harder, and it's a healthy stress. And then you have negative stress, which we call distress. um, so distress, it specifically refers to the negative experience of stress, if you will. And when it comes to scope, of course, stress is broader, and comprised within stress you have distress. Now, I'd like to talk about the big five personality traits. So there's a mnemonics for you to remember. Ocean, so openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and eroticism. And I would like to address some common adjectives that would allow one to address someone who, for example, scores high on openness. So someone who scores high on openness, for example, would receive adjectives such as imaginative, curious, open-minded. Um, Following on, we have conscientiousness, so organization, reliability. Extroversion, you would have sociability, assertiveness. Agreeableness, you have cooperation and compassion. And neuroticism, also called emotional stability, you have anxiety, sadness, and irritability. So these are just some common adjectives that would allow one to address the level um, for each of these personality traits. So our study basically examines the impact of psychological distress and personality traits um, on future levels of either psychological distress or personality traits. We're gonna see how this works in practice in a while. But they used a survey from Australia, um, and a statistical tool to separate some components from this data. And then they found results that support both the theories that say that psychological distress can have a future impact on personality traits, and also they found evidence for personality traits can impact future levels of psychological distress. And of course, we're going to talk about implications for practice, for research, and the limitations for this study. So, for our introduction, I'd like to start talking about the shifts in paradigm. So, there was this vision, this paradigm that personality traits they were stable, immutable components, and then recent research has been challenging this view and addressing the fluid nature of personality traits. So most studies in the area they are cross-sectional studies. So what this means is that they are basically snapshots of these variables, and they don't involve different time points. This impairs our ability to contrast um, individual differences in the variance of these variables. So what these studies have found that neuroticism or emotional stability had the strongest association to psychological distress. Low consciousness and low extroversion also showed some significant association to distress. And then agreeableness and openness did not have that strong of an association with distress. So some frameworks try to explain this relationship between personality traits and distress. The vulnerability model, it basically established a causal relationship from personality traits on distress. So basically personality traits would influence the development and onset of distress. And then you have the SCAR model on the reverse path of this causality, saying that prolonged experience of stress can cause changes in the expression of the traits. And there's not much evidence of longitudinal studies comparing these associations. So this will be, of course, one of the aims of this study. So the longitudinal evidence, as I said, is sparse, and the evidence available does not disentangle within person from between person components of these variables. And why would that be important? So you guys know that between person studies you have basically two groups, and each participant within this group is going to experience a single condition usually. So what happens is that like you have an intervention group, and this intervention group is going to get the treatment, and you have the control group that will get no treatment, and that's it. So you can see they're comparing one group to the other, and this is harder to account for individual differences. So then in within person studies, you have each participant acting as their own control. So what happens is that you're going to compare yourself in time point one to yourself in time point two, and then you can better account for these individual differences. So dealing with the predictive power of variables, it is important to account for individual differences. So prior with in-person findings, it was found that changes in eroticism were bidirectionally associated with negative effect. So it's a reciprocal relationship. Also, increase in conscientiousness was associated with decrease in psychological distress. So we see a negative correlation. And then increase in extroversion found to be associated with the increase in psychological distress. This is a positive association, and it's unexpected because in prior between person studies, it was found that these variables, they were negatively correlated, and as you can see in the within person findings, you can see a positive correlation between the variables. So the present study is gonna use a statistical tool called the Random Intercept Cross-Leg Panel Model, or RICLPM for short. And they're gonna use this tool on longitudinal data to clarify these associations. So what is the cross-leg panel model? So this is basically a tool that is gonna allow one to measure the predictive power of a variable. So supposing you have variables A and B and time points 1 and 2. For this model, you're gonna analyze variable A in time point 1 and its predictive power on time point 2. So in the same way, you can analyze variable B and its predictive power on time point 1 on time point 2 in the other variable. And the RI extension modifies the cross-leg panel model to better address for average levels of these variables. So we are all different, and our individual differences will make us score differently on average for all of these variables. So this RI extension allows to remove this typical or average values from the data and better address only the changes and the variance in the variables. And then the research question was, as I gave some clues before, whether increases or decreases in psychological distress can lead to future increases or decreases in personality traits, and then the reverse path as well. So whether increase or decrease in personality traits can um, yield increase or decrease in psychological distress. And then the hypothesis, since there's not that much evidence, the author did not formulate any hypothesis, but they did expect to um, find evidence for both the vulnerability and the scar models. So our methods, as I said, this is a correlational research with longitudinal data, and this data was gathered by the Household Income and Labor Dynamics in Australia, HILDA for short, and it has been gathering data from since 2001. The surveys happen in 4 ways, 4 years apart each other, and at least 22,837 participants answered at least one of the surveys. Of course, informed consent was obtained from all participants. So for the measures for psychological distress, the author used the Kessler Psychological Distress Scale, the K10, and it was comprised of 10 items, such as how often did you feel so nervous that nothing could calm you down. And the purpose of the scale was to capture symptoms of depression and anxiety in the previous 4 weeks from the survey. And the scale points to rate these items ranged from 1 all of the time to 5 none of the time. For personality measure, Saussures, in 1994, he developed the Big Five Markers scale, and the Hilda team adapted the scale to 28 items. These items, they consist of single adjectives such as talkative, and they are rated in scale points that range from 1, does not describe me at all, to 7, describes me very well. The results, they were separated in within person and between person findings, because remember, the statistical tool allows for this kind of separation. Insignificant associations, so emotional stability or neuroticism, and openness and future psychological distress did not show any strong association. And also the predictive power of psychological distress in future agreeableness and openness was not significant. So besides this, all the other effects were significant, and the authors highlight the increase in extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. They had a strong association with future levels of decreased psychological distress. And also, increases in psychological distress were found to be associated with future, I'm sorry, with future personality changes. So for between person findings, the authors find weak to moderate correlations, and some of these correlations include openness and distress were positively correlated, and the other traits were negatively correlated to distress. So our discussion. So the aim of the study was to analyze this reciprocal effect. So both psychological distress on personality traits and personality traits on psychological distress. And these findings suggest that these two variables they are longitudinally associated, and because of that you have evidence for both the vulnerability and the scar models. Support to theories, you have the five-factor theory that it resembles the vulnerability model. So it will state that any changes in personality traits will lead to changes in psychological distress, but the theory does not explain the reverse pathway. So the changes in psychological distress leading to changes in personality, but this is explained by the dynamic personality theories. So these theories they will say that personality traits and daily experiences are constantly interacting in a reciprocal way. And of course, the findings of the study support this notion. Um, they also suggest that prolonged exposure to psychological distress will lead to changes in the expression of the traits. So, comparing to previous studies, it has been found previously that changes in psychological well-being, social well-being, and subjective well-being as well are associated with changes in personality traits. But these findings they talked about the positive dimensions of well-being, and the novelty of this research is that it talks about the negative dimensions of well-being, which is psychological distress and how it can impact personality traits. Implications for practice. So all these findings suggest that we got to develop interventions that can elicit changes in the traits so we can possibly normalize psychological distress levels. Also, personality must be considered or should be considered when developing interventions in light of these findings. And also, chronic distress may precede changes in traits. So, when you have conditions such as PTSD, when you have really high levels of psychological distress, you can expect to have changes in personality because of that. Implications for research. So the lag length for this study was 4 years. And how can it impact the predictive power of the variable? So if I have a shorter lag, how will this impact all these associations and their intensity as well? Also, since it's a correlational study, we still need additional evidence to establish causality relationships. The limitations of this study, of course, since the authors used S data, you can have a lot of bias, such as the fish and water effect. When it comes to generalizability of the findings, since the sample was solely comprised by Australians, you have limited generalizability. Also, since we have a relatively big lag, we cannot know for sure what is the short-term predictive power of the variables. The author also mentions unmeasured variables, and then we can infer that he's talking about extraneous or confound variables. And since it's observational data from correlational research, it's hard to establish causal relationships between the variables. Here's the reference. If you need to look into this article, you can always send me an email as well, and I can forward you the PDF for it. Thank you so much, guys, and if you have any questions, now is the time to ask me. Thank you so much. Okay, since we have no questions for now, I think that's it for today. Once more, I would like to thank you for listening to me, and I really hope you were able to understand what I talked about today. Thank you so much.